At dawn on June 19, 1944, the sea east of Saipan was calm enough to be deceiving. A Japanese petty officer aboard the destroyer Yukikaze stood watch as the horizon brightened, expecting, at most, one American scouting plane. That had been the rhythm of earlier battles: brief aerial appearances, gaps of silence, then the strike. Instead, the sound never stopped. Engines layered over engines. A distant hum became a ceiling of noise that refused to lift. For the first time, Japanese sailors were confronting something they had not planned for, not trained against, and not fully understood: continuous carrier patrols. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the war believing air power was decisive but fleeting. Aircraft launched, attacked, returned. The sea between those moments was supposed to belong to ships. But by mid-1944, that assumption was already obsolete. From the flight decks of Task Force 58, under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, American carriers were no longer just striking platforms. They were airborne factories. Fighters lifted off at dawn, circled for hours, refueled, landed, and were replaced by others. The sky did not reset. It stayed occupied. On Japanese decks, the psychological shift was immediate and brutal. Aboard the carrier Zuikaku, veteran sailors, men who had survived Pearl Harbor and Midway, began to realize that there were no safe intervals anymore. No moment to repair damage in daylight. No clean window to refuel or maneuver without being seen. The air above them had become hostile territory. The Americans called it the Combat Air Patrol, CAP. To Japanese sailors, it felt like being watched without blinking. By June 20th, during what would become known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese pilots were being shot down so far from their carriers that many never even saw an enemy ship. The sailors waiting below heard nothing but radio silence, and then, hours later, learned that entire air groups were gone. Not damaged, gone. Below decks, the heat was suffocating. Ventilation systems struggled as ships zigzagged constantly to avoid submarines and air attack. Diesel fumes mixed with sweat and fear. Sailors slept in short bursts, boots on, life jackets nearby, because alarms came without warning now. Not once or twice a day, but endlessly. The Americans had solved a problem the Japanese had not anticipated: pilot endurance and aircraft rotation. On USS Enterprise, CV-6, pilots of VF-6 and VF-10 rotated through patrol shifts with clockwork precision. Deck crews worked under floodlights at night, refueling and rearming fighters so they could be back in the air before dawn. Radar operators tracked contacts long before Japanese lookouts could see anything with binoculars. Japanese ships had no comparable radar coverage. Many relied on visual spotting and limited early warning sets that struggled in heavy weather. A sailor on lookout duty had seconds, sometimes less, between first sight and impact. On July 24, 1944, during carrier raids against the Philippines, a Japanese oiler south of Luzon was attacked 3 separate times in one day. Each time, the crew believed the raid was over once the planes disappeared. Each time, new aircraft arrived, fresh, fast, relentless. The ship never finished firefighting before the next attack began. This was not how naval warfare was supposed to work. Japanese doctrine had emphasized the decisive battle, the single, massive clash where fleets would meet and annihilate one another. Continuous pressure, attrition from the air, psychological exhaustion — these were not the weapons the Imperial Navy had prepared its sailors for. The effect showed in small, human details. Men stopped shaving. Letters went unwritten because sailors no longer believed they would survive long enough for them to matter. Mess halls emptied during daylight hours. Eating became something done quickly, half-hidden, ready to run. On some ships, sailors quietly slept with their hands gripping railings, not out of superstition, but because the constant vibration of engines and distant aircraft had trained their bodies never to fully relax. By October 1944, during the lead-up to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the pattern repeated on an even larger scale. Japanese sailors aboard battleships like Yamato and Musashi watched the sky fill with American fighters long before any torpedo bombers arrived. They learned, too late, that the fighters were not just escorts, they were hunters, strafing gun crews, knocking out rangefinders, killing exposed crewmen, making the deck uninhabitable. When Musashi was attacked on October 24th, she endured wave after wave of aircraft launched from USS Intrepid, USS Franklin, and USS Essex. The sailors below could tell when one attack ended only because another began. There was no silence, no pause, just damage control alarms overlapping like panicked voices. One surviving petty officer later recalled that the most terrifying part was not the bombs, it was the waiting that never ended. You could not count the attacks. You could not tell yourself that was the last one. The sky had become permanent. For American sailors, this system was exhausting but controlled. For Japanese sailors, it was chaos without rhythm. Fuel shortages made it worse. Japanese carriers could not afford to keep fighters aloft continuously. Pilots had to be conserved. Aircraft were precious. When they landed, the sky emptied, and American planes flooded into that gap immediately. Sailors watched helplessly as their ships were exposed the moment their own air cover touched down. By 1945, as American carriers closed on the home islands, continuous patrols became a form of siege warfare. Minesweepers, coastal patrol boats, even fishing vessels were attacked from the air. Japanese sailors understood then that the sea itself no longer offered refuge. On March 18, 1945, carrier aircraft struck Kure Naval Base repeatedly throughout the day. Sailors attempting to abandon damaged ships were strafed as they swam. Survivors clung to debris while aircraft circled overhead, engines droning, denying even the illusion of escape. This was not just air superiority, it was air permanence. Japanese sailors had been trained to fear moments, the instant a torpedo struck, the split second before a bomb detonated. What broke them was something else, the understanding that the threat was always present, that vigilance could never drop, that exhaustion was not a phase, but a condition. In the final months of the war, intercepted Japanese communications increasingly spoke of unending enemy aircraft. Not large attacks, not specific squadrons, just the sky itself, described as hostile. The sailors had expected waves. What they faced instead was a ceiling. And under that ceiling, the Imperial Japanese Navy slowly ceased to function. Not just in ships sunk, but in minds worn down by a war that no longer allowed them to breathe.